Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 115th video in our second Master Series, the 64th video in our basic processors, the 27th video on sculpting processors, and the 4th video on harmonics. And in this video, we are going to discuss using trash and frequency splitting. So we'll use the equalizer a little bit also, but this is very it's a simplification workflow, because most of the time whenever I'm using my trash, like we talked about in saturation, a lot of times that what can happen there is you end up with a situation to where you might add, let's say, even or odd harmonics. I went in here and I added some odd harmonics. And instead of going through all the process of channel splitting and all kinds of things, that you put an EQ on afterwards and do some shaping of the envelope, so that you might be having odd harmonics going in places you don't want, but you may have to go in there and shape the envelope a little bit, contain it, and let it work simply that way, adding some even or odd harmonics and then shaping with an EQ afterwards. It's a pretty simplified, simple workflow to help, because you basically want to boost those harmonics up in this area that you can control with the Q as it's adding harmonics from something like trash 2, or in this area, or if you move the envelope somewhere else, wherever the envelope of sound might be, to try to contain it, because they don't come out controlled. So that's a very simple way to go about dealing with that, which is a really simplified workflow. The other way is coming in here like with this. Now, there is a tool like Sigmod here that I recommend that's a pretty cool tool for splitting channels, so that you can isolate frequency ranges and things like that, also for doing this type of work, dealing with harmonics. Now, granted, with this, we are not going to get to control, like we talked about in the last video, with equalization. Equalization, controlling harmonics when you're boosting and or attenuating them, is very controlled that way, with automation, so I mean, but it's hard to add harmonics. You can't add harmonics that way with an equalizer, and the only way to do that with something that will add harmonics. So something like trash 2 is the first thing we're looking at, because we can add, like we talked about when we're doing saturation, we can add saturation, square clipping harmonics, odd harmonics, even and odd harmonics, just about any type of harmonics that are the majority of what we're looking for. And thus we're trying to really work with non-harmonic harmonics, parts of a sound, which are a little bit more difficult to deal with. You have to work with those sometimes with some more specific applications. Something like RX can do that sometimes, and things like that, MATLAB, but otherwise you're basically stuck trying to sculpt it with something like this. But after we get in here and start looking at this, we don't have as much control, but what we can do is a couple different things. First of all, that we can split the channel. In my DAW, I can split channels. So I've got this frequency split thing up to 200 hertz, from 200 to 500 hertz, from 500 to 1,000, and then from 1,000 to 3 kilohertz, and then from 3 kilohertz up is the last one in the line here. So I can go in there and add harmonics where I want. And I also can adjust the level somewhat like equalization without actually processing. I'm just boosting and attenuate levels in those areas. It can be a little different depending on if the processor affects the sound. But this is a very cool way to do this, because then you can go in there and say you just want to add harmonics between, let's say, between 2 and 5K, or between 2 and 5 hertz, kilohertz. or 200 and 500 hertz between there. So in between there, you would have this second area that you could add harmonics into. So you could use something like Trash 2 here to add even and odd harmonics, even or odd harmonics, into just that frequency range of 300 hertz. Does that make sense? Or you can narrow the band. You have to remember that with this, it's not really going to follow the envelope unless we're doing automation. So you'd have to do that with an equalizer after it following the automation if you were doing something like that. But a lot of times, as you simplify and doing it like this, if it didn't take care of it when you're doing like just adding even and odd harmonics, that sometimes can be looked at as saturation work, or you actually add them a little bit more aggressively and possibly sculpt the envelope a little bit with an EQ afterwards to actually boost and attenuate some harmonics. Besides, you're working with the EQ, you're also adding harmonics before it and then sculpting it with equalizer afterwards. That can get it done a lot of times, but sometimes this is another workflow that can work pretty well, that you've just got this area that between, you know, such and such harmonics, you want to add some even or odd harmonics, or in the upper end or just the lower end. Just remember, most of the time, anytime you're doing that, that they multiply. So it's not just going to do it in that area. Like if I add them in the lower area, it's going to start affecting those harmonics, which those harmonics, if it starts causing distortion off them that are causing other harmonics, they may go outside of the range of the frequency split. Meaning they're going to be coming out here, they just won't be in between 200 and 500 hertz because it's causing distortion, which causes harmonics, which we're trying to add with Trash 2, that may go outside of that area, outside farther out into the envelope and envelope's tail, which you got to be careful of and go back and maybe put an EQ on afterwards to shape it a little bit. But it's a pretty simple concept. It's not really complicated. It's not. It's most of these concepts are just throwing them out there to help you figure out what kind of workflow is going to work to get something done. Does that make sense? The less processing you do, the better. And especially when you're working with harmonics, a lot of times it's a little bit more broader range that you're trying to add or subtract, add harmonic content to it. With just an equalizer, you're boosting and attenuating harmonics, but when you're adding them to it, a lot of times it can be a little broader or it can be very surgical. So you have to kind of figure out what you're really trying to do there. And like we talked about before, shaping the envelope is a concept. If you put in this Trash 2 on here possibly and adding odd or even harmonics and then an equalizer afterwards, that you're just boosting right between 1 and 2K or something like that, or even between, you know, 500 and 1000K or something like that, or even smaller and smaller area, depending on what you're trying to get done. So this takes quite a bit of experimentation on your part and tools like this to get it done. Sigmod, if you have Studio One, which I use, you know, this is a great tool to try to be able to split the frequencies to do different things, because sometimes you affect different areas and it has a totally different effect, especially when you're working on harmonics. That when you start trying to add them in there, that in here that I'm only going to be adding harmonics into this certain area. So if I look at my splitter on this last area, that it's going to be between 1K and 3 kilohertz, 1,000 kilohertz and 3,000 kilohertz, and we'll be adding some even harmonics in there because it needs it in there to try to fill out the sound. After I've experimented with it for a while. So as you start to add stuff in there, you can break it down. The less stuff you add, the less mess and mud you make. So let's say you added even harmonics in there and it's not sounding really good, but you kind of want to figure out a little bit smaller range of what is actually causing it to sound good instead of, you know, all over the spectrum of the sound. Does that make sense? To keep it as clean as possible, not put processing where you don't need to. So this is a really good way to isolate the frequency range that you might be adding any of these harmonics we're talking about with something like Trash 2 that I just love, because I can add, most of the time it's even or odd harmonics. Sometimes it's even and odd harmonics, but those are the principal ones we're normally trying to add. Sometimes we might add some clipping distortion that's going to add odd harmonics, possibly a little bit of even harmonics, and some non-harmonic distortion harmonics that into there, or aggressive distortion or something like that. But most of the time it's the basic ones that we're really dealing with and really want to add in. And this is a great way to do it. It just takes a little bit of experimentation on your part. And don't forget that whenever you're doing that, you're doing it in the lower area there, that you can sculpt it also. That I've got it to where it's between 2 and 5 hertz, or however I had it here, between up to 200 hertz. And then I've got it, I want to shape it a little bit. Does that make sense? To where I want it to resonate right in this area right here, because it's a kick drum or something. And I want it to resonate right in that area or something like that. And I'm trying to control the envelope of sound a little bit as I add, some even harmonics or odd harmonics or even and odd harmonics into it. And then I'm kind of trying to control the envelope in that general area after I've split, the frequency ranges up. And there's multiple ways to do it. And the more you think about it, the more you do it. But this is a very simple application using Trash 2 to try to add harmonics. And it just takes some experimentation on your part, really seeing what it does, taking some vocals, whatever sounds that you're normally used to working with, and start trying to add even or odd or even and odd harmonics in those areas. Generally, those are the ones you're normally trying to add in there anyway. And maybe some distortion or something like that in a specific range or area, and just experiment with it. Just don't forget a lot of times that afterwards you might have an EQ on afterwards somewhere here to shape the envelope of sound a little bit, because it might add a little bit of harmonics where you didn't want it. And now with that tool, it's very difficult to add, well, I really want to boost the third, or the octave harmonic. Trash 2, I've not been able to get it to work that surgical. So working with it like this, if it's not just adding some odd harmonics or adding some even odd harmonics or just doing saturation, that normally you got to go in there and do a little bit of sculpting with your EQ to maybe it might have added more harmonics in the lower end you want to do, so you attenuate it a little bit or boost it over here, shape the envelope a little bit, and then kind of work with it a little bit. And you can normally come out with some really nice sounds that way, because then you take the time to kind of shape it as you're adding whatever harmonics you're trying to do and whatever specific range that you might be shooting for. So it's a pretty simple concept, and you can also do it in just the upper, the lower end. I mean, you can be trying to boost just in the upper end or just the lower end, or anything like that. And there's, multiple ways like we talked about, in different ranges or areas that you might be trying to boost like I showed you with this. But it's a pretty simple concept that's just going to take experimentation on your part. But it's a valid workflow that you just have to work on figuring out when it's going to be usable for you and in what applications. The more genre-oriented and work-oriented in certain types of fields you're working in, the more you can generalize your workflow and simplify your workflow to get things done that you can use over and over again, that isn't experimenting around with all kinds of different ways trying to get something done from some certain situation or application you might be working in. But a lot of times this is a really good way to do it. I love my Trash 2 for adding saturation and things like that. And it's great for this because most of the time I can get away with it like this unless it becomes real surgical, where I have to get in there with something like, matte, or I have to get in there with something like RX or Melodyne or something like that, because I've got one harmonic, or I'm trying to add one harmonic, or I'm trying to attenuate just one harmonic, or I'm trying to, add several thirds or fifths or something like that. It's very difficult to do with this type of, what's available in this type of situation and this type of workflow. But it can do a lot. So you may just want to be working in the lower end, in the mid-range, and the upper end, or, not quite the lower end, or not quite the mid-range, and in those areas to add some harmonics, some type of harmonics that just, oh yeah, now Bob's little country voice just sounds so cool, dude, and it's like, you know what I'm saying? Whatever it takes, and normally that's how it works a lot of times, and it doesn't need to get really super surgical, but sometimes it does, and sometimes the more picky of a listener you are, and the more critical of a listener you are, a lot more surgical you'll get at times. So I hope that that made that very simple and very clear to just get you started and get you utilizing that, get you practicing with it, and get you trying to implement it on some of your stuff and some of your sound files that you have, and just kind of see what you can do with it. Be self-love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.